Before we go any further, I just wanted to go through the setup on a speed bump. Now everybody's Jeep's different. We don't know if you have 37s, if you're running 40-inch tires, if you're running 3 inches, we don't know what your conditions are. So what we did is we included a box of shims with your speed bumps, so it gives you some spacers that you'll be able to use to really just position the up travel and limit it where you want it to be. So what we've done on this Jeep is we've brought the axle to the very highest position we want it to be. That is, its maximum compression. We don't want that axle to go any higher. When we've done that, I've taken a speed bump and we've just really just emptied the insides out of it so that it's just a mock-up. So this shaft is completely compressed in it. And I've just slid it up in here just for demonstration purposes so you can see what we're trying to do. If this suspension was completely collapsed, this would be up against here. That would be our goal. We don't want it to be any higher than this. So what we need to do is fill this gap. Now when you're doing yours, you'll just take your measuring tape and just measure it out. You can see how much down travel you're going to have. You've got your 4-inch shaft, the overall shaft there. But with this compressed, you'll be about a 1/2 inch down, so you'll be about 2 3/4 of an inch there. So we need to fill this gap. Now there's a couple of ways we can do it. We also have spacers available. Now where you've got the amount of up travel that this does, he's got a 60 in here, so we're going to limit it right where it is, and it'll all vary depending on how big of an axle you're using and so forth. So there's that. We need to fill that gap. We've got that much filled. If we bring that down, that's exactly where we want that to stop. We want no further movement. So if we go into our shim pack, we can take this the 1/2 inch shim spacer. It looks like if we slid that on that shaft, just slide that on it, slide it up into position, that'll shim that speed bump down enough to fill in that additional gap, and we should be just perfect. So we use this spacer, bolt it in, put the spacer on it, silicone it in, put the clamp on, and we'll be there. Now we've been using the shock as a safety while we were measuring the axle at full stuff. We want to get that axle back out of the way, so let's remove the lower shock bolt. Measure down from the bottom of the spring bucket about 3.5 inches. A piece of tape will work great as a cutting guide. Now on this install, we used a die grinder with a cutoff wheel to make the cut, but a Sawzall is really my tool of choice. On this install, we're going to weld that jounce tube brace, so we need to do some paint cleanup on both the spring bucket and the jounce support. A clean weld is a happy weld. The squared off section of the jounce tube is going to go to the inside. Its position isn't really critical as long as the support sits flat for minimal gap welding. On this install, we're adding an extra 1/2 inch spacer to compensate for some additional weight that we're going to be adding to the front. These spacers are designed to fit on a jounce tube, but without the support welded to it, so the spacer may need a little persuasion. If you feel it's too tight, clearance the inside of the spacer a little. Just give it some love and it'll go. Don't forget to reinstall that factory isolator. We covered the speed bumps with a little coat of silicone to prevent noise and corrosion. Slide on the retainer clamp at the top, and that speed bump's done. Next up is the sway bar links. Now if your links are the double loop end style, you'll need to push the sleeve out of one end so that the link can be pushed onto that disconnect stud. They're tight to get out, but you can do it. If you have the type of link with the tie rod end looking ball stud at one end, the joined end is going to go to the top. And if you're lucky enough to have a Rubicon, you'll need to clearance that sway bar itself just a little bit to be able to get that stud to push into the sway bar. The upper bracket and bullet use the body mount for mounting. Just remove the body mount nut and position the bracket so that that stud can be used as a place to swing the link up and park it when the link is disconnected. Tighten the stud with a 14mm. Hit that lower disconnect pin with a little grease. You'll thank yourself later. The coil spring goes in pretty easy on the driver's side, but make sure you have that lower bump pad inside the spring when you slide it into position. It's so disappointing when you have to remove the spring when you discover that it won't fit between the coils. Oh, by the way, on this install, we replaced the stock 44 with a TeraFlex, so we didn't need to drill that 5/16 hole in the center of the factory bump pad to accept the extended bump stop mounting bolt. If you don't have a ratchet mounted Allen wrench and you have to tighten those bump stop retaining bolts with an Allen wrench, pack a lunch. With the spring installed, we can finalize the connection of the sway bar link. Now the loop end style link will reuse the factory hardware. Install the shocks by just starting the nut on the top, then installing the bolt in the lower mount. It'll give you some extra movement for installing that lower shock bolt. Once they're in, tighten them up. On the rear, first remove the park brake cable hanger bracket and discard. This will gain us a lot more cable length for group. Now the control arms should still be loose, and the long arms will provide plenty of flex to easily remove those rear springs once the shocks and sway bars have been removed. Be sure to support the axle with something that will allow the lifting and lowering of the axle housing. Keep an eye on the brake lines and that ABS line. If they start to stretch, stop and loosen the retaining bracket or the clips just to gain some extra length. Push the factory isolator onto the new spring spacer. The extended centerpiece on that new spacer will act as a guide for the spring after a full flex. The new spring spacer also pushes into the spring bucket and locks into place. Trust me, put some lube on it. We use a block of wood between the axle and the spacer, and we raise the axle up like a press to push it in. A real man can actually push them in by hand. Throw the springs back in, and bolt in that lower spring retainer. The shocks will keep the spring in place. If you loosen the brake lines at the frame bracket before undoing the bracket, it'll make life a lot easier than trying to hold it somehow. The original bolt is used on the banjo fittings at the caliper. Use the new copper washers that came with the kit. Now because these new brake lines are a different style, we'll need to use the new hardware that came with the kit to attach the line to the frame. Once you got everything all tightened up on the brake lines, the final step will be to install the brake line clip. Just tap it into place. The speed bumps install with the speed bump offset to the front of the Jeep. The longer section of the mounting plate will be to the rear. The sway bar links install with the top and bottom mounted to the inside of the arm and the axle bracket. We're almost there. Position the fuel tank for install and reconnect the fuel and electrical connectors. Be careful not to break a nail. Guide the tank into place and install the mounting bolts and fill hoses. This would be a good time to paint all your brackets. Once the tank's all installed, get the Jeep back on the ground and go through and tighten up all the arms. A lot of guys like to just do that tighten up process once it's on the alignment rack.